And I've said animals here, but just think more generically, as we move up trophic pyramids, the organisms play fundamental roles. Okay, we tend to organize those by, if you think about sort of basic ecology, at the bottom we have primary producers, then we have primary, secondary, tertiary consumers building up that trophic pyramid. But mostly I'm going to talk about animals today. I guess insects, and insects are huge players. So not just herbivores like the ones that we imagine on the Serengeti, but anything that's consuming the product of primary productivity. Okay, so how are animals regulating trophic dynamics? If you look at this ecosystem here, how are animals likely to be affecting this ecosystem in ways that matter for carbon storage, nutrient cycling, all the things that we've been talking about? Okay, what does that do?
I mean, if you talk about carbon storage, if they're eating stuff, then that's less biomass.
Okay, so they're eating, they're controlling at some level the amount of productivity in an ecosystem, right? Or at least biomass in an ecosystem. And so when we think about trophic dynamics and the controls on ecosystem processes, we generally think of animals as the controls are top down. Okay, and some of you may have heard this concept along the way, basic ecological concept. Bottom up versus top down controls on ecosystem processes. Okay, and herbivory is one of the, if not the most important, top down control on ecosystems, right? It regulates the amount of productivity, the amount of biomass in systems, how much nutrient cycling happens. How could animals, we've already thought about this at least a little bit, and on the exam I had a specific example of this that I don't think I ever returned to. But how can animals either accelerate or suppress nutrient cycling? So the example I gave you that showed that productivity increased with grasshopper density, which might seem counterintuitive, right? You might expect that grasshoppers would provide a negative effect, a top-down control on productivity. But on that particular graph, I had grasshoppers on the x-axis, so as they are controlling the amount of productivity, and as grasshopper density went up, productivity went up. So how could herbivory in that case, which clearly can consume biomass and provide a top-down negative effect on productivity, how could actually grasshoppers enhance productivity?
Speed up the cycle in terms of how quickly they return high nutrient content to the soil.
Yeah, so think about, and that was a Palouse prairie, which was relevant, and maybe some of you don't know much about a Palouse prairie, but a Palouse prairie is a very diverse grassland ecosystem. So grasshoppers are preferentially browsing on some species and avoiding others, okay? And so by doing that, there's two mechanisms that could actually have enhanced productivity. One is that they're sort of enriching nutrients, so they're preying, or they're browsing on grasses and then returning that in a more mineralizable form that can then be used by the plants that are remaining. But by selectively browsing on some species, they're favoring others, okay? And so you can actually get release, and this is part of what invasive species and effects of invasive species on ecosystems. They tend to show that when you add invasive species to ecosystems, you actually see big increases in productivity because the things that are preying on them or browsing them in their native habitats aren't here, and so they get this enemy release hypothesis. So when you bring plants and organisms to their non-native ranges, they can suddenly capitalize and exploit resources, but they're not being browsed and preyed on by because their enemies and their predators aren't here. But in the grasshopper case, they're actually increasing productivity by enhancing nutrient inputs that are favoring the species that are not being browsed. So that really only works in a diverse community where you have a bunch of different plants and a bunch of different strategies. And so you see this actual counter to what you might predict in response to herbivory and actual increase in productivity. For the most part, herbivory and higher trophic levels are decreasing productivity. But beyond this, This is another really great example, ecosystem level consequences of different trophic levels. So this is the Clark's nutcracker that we have around here, and it's one of its main food sources is whitebark pine. And whitebark pine is this, it used to be at least, this sort of dominant high elevation species around here that's an important source for a food source for grizzly bears. So someone jump in if you know more, Dan, especially if you know more. Like up to 30%, I think, of their calories in some cases used to come, and still do in places where you have whitebark pine seed production. They use them to fatten up before wintertime. Now this species has just been hammered by a combination of climate change, which has contributed to high elevation and much more success and higher movement of mountain pine beetle, and white pine blister rust, which arrived from Europe, decades ago. But it's essentially wiped. People are talking about whitebark pine as a functionally extinct species. Okay, it's still reproducing and there are still individuals, but as a functional group, it's largely been removed or is being removed from the landscape. And there's this really interesting role where grizzly bears eat these guys also do. They cache the seeds all around. And Clark's nutcrackers are essentially responsible for distributing whitebark pine around the landscape. So when you get big diebacks, you lose the birds, you lose the ability to reproduce the species, you lose things like grizzly bears, and then ultimately these communities get replaced by spruce and other types of forests. So a really interesting set of ecological feedbacks between a primary producer, a primary consumer, and then a high-level carnivore in that system. One of the places where I've worked in Hawaii has an invasive feral pig problem. And so the feral pigs were actually introduced to Hawaii as a food source for the people traveling back and forth across the Pacific. They knew they would need food, so they dumped a bunch of animals, knowing when they arrived there on their trips across the Pacific, they could hunt these pigs. And they're having massive ecological effects in Hawaii. So they dig up native plants, they create these interesting and really common patchy, disturbed spots for non-native species. And Hawaii is just incredible in terms of the effects of non-native species and the effects on ecosystem, the transformation of ecosystem processes here. But this is one example of a trophic. What sort of effects would you imagine this would have on this ecosystem from an ecosystem like nutrient energy flow perspective, beyond providing niche spaces for non-native species?
Runoff.
Okay, so you could see more erosion, right? And you're essentially creating these vast devegetated zones, so more runoff. What else?
Herbivores might not like the non-native species as much, so it could impact higher trophic levels.
Okay, so you have, and that's, whether it's directly related to these pigs or not is not as obvious to me, but there's lots of examples of why non-native species having big effects on higher trophic levels, right? You replace, especially where you have lots of endemic species like you do in Hawaii, and invasive species.
Maybe if the pigs prefer some certain type of vegetation, that type of vegetation might be a part of like a larger trophic scene, so they might interrupt that.
For sure, and like recovering vegetation, and maybe they're browsing certain seedlings, and so you're getting a shifting of the types of species and trajectory of recovery. Think about the other processes like decomposition. How is this likely to affect decomposition? How come? You're right, but
Just disturbing the ground, and then adding nutrients that needs.
yeah, so it's just like plowing the field, right? In an agricultural system, these things essentially just uproot the soil, right? They're looking for grubs and things underground, and so they just turn it upside down. The same way that plowing fields takes carbon that's buried in soils and turns it back up to the surface of the surface, and you can get enhanced rates of decomposition from aeration, from temperature, from more moisture, all those sorts of things that tend to favor microorganisms. And if this carbon, for example, is sitting deeper in the soil, protected from decomposition, and it's regularly kind of just churned up, that almost always translates to a big loss of carbon. And as a consequence of losing carbon, you're also accelerating nutrient turnover. Okay? Decomposition, nutrient cycling and decomposition are completely coupled, right? So in places where you have higher rates of carbon losses, you're also going to have higher rates of nutrient turnover. These are everywhere in Hawaii. When you're working, you find places where they're trying to actually exclude these herbivores. And some of our best, most informative studies on the effects of trophic dynamics on ecosystems have come using exclosure studies. So what happens when you exclude herbivores from this particular landscape? And there's all sorts of really cool studies and papers around showing some of those effects. And Isle Royale, at some level, is the natural experiment that I'll show you in a little bit. But beyond that, these exclosure experiments are really important for establishing how, when you remove one trophic member from the ecosystem, how does that affect the other pieces of it? It's pretty stunning. There's been Rocky Mountain National Park, the elk, and the effects of elk elk herbivory in the absence of large predators, right? And some of those studies and those sorts of things are in the New York Times and the popular press all the time. This is one of the biggest ones in the rainforest where I work, and that's the leafcutter ants. So leafcutter ants essentially rapidly accelerate rates of decomposition. They also have big effects on primary productivity. Insects, especially in this system, are the big players, the big herbivores. There's an interesting study, and some of the people here actually have been interested in this and studying this at some level, but why aren't there more and bigger herbivores in the tropical rainforest? It's this hugely productive system. Almost none of the NPP goes consumed. What does get consumed is actually consumed by insects, so why aren't there more large herbivores in rainforests? Any hypotheses?
Mature rainforest, you mentioned that there's not much understory.
There's not much, but you can see this is a mature rainforest, giant trees. There's still a lot of capacity to sustain herbivores here. There isn't an answer. I think it's an ongoing kind of question about how do you explain the lack of large herbivores in tropical rainforests? The biggest one, I think, is probably the tapir, the Baird's tapir, and Baird's tapirs are like the rainforest cow. You guys seen pictures of what a tapir looks like? They're awesome, and they're almost blind, so you can walk right up to them, and they don't know. They see with their noses, and they have like this elephant proboscis thing that they see you coming with their nose. But they really are just grazing and browsing on fruits, really, that have already fallen from trees. And so they're not actively browsing and killing or reducing NPP. They're browsing and eating things that have already fallen to the ground. There's brocket deer, so there's a really tiny miniature deer species that's in the tropics. There are peccaries and things like that. But given, you look at this across different ecosystems where, like in Africa, where there's tons of large herbivores, this place is pretty striking in that it lacks bigger and very many herbivores, except insects. But this is just such a cool set of ecological interactions. Leafcutter ants, they essentially harvest leaves from the tops of canopies, and so everywhere you go in this system, you see these chains of leafcutter ants going up and down these trees. They build these huge colonies. They can extend 10, 15 meters underground. They excavate them, so they're bringing really deep soils up to the surface. They take their leaves down into these giant colonies, and they deposit the leaves on the ground, and what that actually does is they cultivate a fungus. So they don't eat the leaves, they create these big piles of debris inside that starts growing fungus as it decomposes, and then the ants consume the fungus. But as a part of this, it's taking nutrients from 15 meters down in the soil and bringing it right back to the surface. And likewise taking things from the surface and putting them back down at the bottom. And if you find systems where, it's impossible to exclude these things, but in systems where they're common, it's estimated that they essentially turn over the entire forest in 30 to 40 years. So they're huge players in this landscape for redistributing nutrients, for creating flow passages for water, and all these really cool effects. I have Fiona, who you guys met. She's studying, actually, these guys are so cool. They take the things below ground, it decomposes, and then they have refuse underground, and they bring it back up, and they create refuse piles on the exterior. And they meticulously take these things, and they won't touch them. They won't walk on the refuse piles. They find a stick, and then they drop it from below, and they create these big piles. And she's found wastewater treatment plant size fluxes of nitrous oxide out of these waste plants. So they do really, another example of just a kind of a cool creature, but has really profound ecosystem effects. Rates of nitrogen mineralization and CO2 fluxes from these things are just off the charts. So they're really these hot spots of processing. We've all seen stuff like this driving around the West, right? And so overgrazing and herbivory clearly has massive effects on this, especially in the desert Southwest. This is another really just amazing set of interactions. So some of you, growing up and living in the Front Range of Colorado, or doing my graduate work in the Front Range of Colorado, and I'm a backcountry skier. And every spring, we would be characterized by a big snowstorm in the spring, and the snow would melt, and your cars would be red or pink. And the snowpack in the summer, the spring snowpack, by the end of sort of the winter, would be either pink or kind of black from dust having been deposited on this. The dust being linked to overgrazing in the desert Southwest, which drives increases in erosion from aeolian movement of these eroded Colorado Plateau sediments and then deposition back on the Front Range. Okay, so it's affecting this system in that it represents a loss. Overgrazing represents a loss of soils out of here, but also affecting a downwind ecosystem. Not just because it sucks to ski on dirty snow, but also because the dust being deposited on snow has big effects on the albedo, which affects the rate at which it melts, and all these just amazing set of ecological feedbacks as a result of, just in this case, just an overabundance of herbivores on this landscape. Okay, so what do we mean by trophic dynamics? My favorite, I think, representation and formal, description of this came from this guy, Lindemann, in 1931. And if you are interested in sort of old classic literature, that's, it was so right on. And it's still one that gets cited all the time in discussions and studies about trophic dynamics. But Lindemann essentially suggested that in thinking about trophic dynamics, we consider this packet of energy. So a packet of energy, solar radiation coming into the system, right? This solar radiation essentially is driving primary productivity, and that is what is driving all of these trophic dynamics. So it all starts with primary productivity. This would be an example of a aquatic ecosystem, and this would be more an example of a, I guess both of these, he's got open and then, or open water, and then he's got a more of a detritus system. But it comes in, he gets grazed, and then at the heart of this bacterial ooze. It's like so cool how you could write science back in the day. Speaking of this, have you guys ever read this article? I'll actually circulate it. The Pond as a Microcosm. Have you heard about this newspaper? It's like from the 1880s. You're nodding your head. Yeah. Have you read it?
A long time ago.
Oh my gosh. I read it this weekend because it was part of a blog that I was reading on science communication and how different we communicate science now compared to what they did back in the 1800s in that case. But it was just it was like poetry, right? You're just reading and you could imagine how, if you're talking to someone now, how differently you would say it and how they would just be like, what? Back then, it was just like talking about bringing personal experiences into observations of natural history. This has a little bit of this too, and I think that the ooze, right? Everyone can understand what that means. It's not it's not a biofilm. It's just an ooze. But at every point here, right? We have a primary trophic level, secondary, tertiary, and so we're moving up trophic levels here as we. Starting from solar radiation, and then everything essentially is ending back up in this detritus. Okay, so unconsumed primary productivity in terrestrial ecosystems ends up in detritus, and detrital food webs operate on their own as well. Okay, so we have, and typically when we talk about trophic levels, we talk about primary producers and then primary, secondary, tertiary consumers. Okay, and those can be either on the detritus side or on the plant-based side. These are heterotrophic organisms, so we start with autotrophs, and then as we move through the trophic levels, we're talking about heterotrophs. But at the base, again, you can have a detrital-based food web, but ultimately the detritus is being added through primary production. Okay, so a plant-based trophic system, NPP is at the base, right? We have herbivores here. Some of that mass, some of that NPP, the biomass of NPP is actually translating to the biomass of herbivores, but that's very inefficient. Most of it, as you move through these different trophic levels, most of that is actually lost as respiration, the vast majority of it. If you have an herbivore browsing NPP, it's respiring, create biomass. When that dies, it actually enters the detritus pool. And then this detritus pool, you can have bacteria and fungi, right, that are consuming these other organisms, consuming bacteria and fungi. At every point, you have respiration and then dead material entering back into this detritus that's providing the base for that system. Okay, so they're mostly the same, in that there's lots of inefficiency. Most is lost through respiration, and ultimately, as the cells of these organisms, these different trophic levels die, they come back into this detritus food web. So if we talk about carbon losses at a global scale, most of it is this, right? This is a very small proportion of the global carbon cycle, even in systems that have lots of trophic levels in them. Most of the energy is entering this dead organic matter pool, and that is what is being respired and lost in the atmosphere.
What's the M? Sorry.
M, good question. It's in the book. I took this right out of the book. Let's look. Or maybe it's on my thing here. Microbivores. So bacteria and fungi is B and F. Microbivores, carnivores, etc. Okay, so you can have, even in a detrital-based food system, it's just talking about what's at the bottom. You can still have these sort of higher trophic levels, these more, things that are consuming, like an amoeba, right? A microbivore would be like an amoeba or a flagellated organism that's engulfing bacteria and fungi and consuming it. And likewise, not just carbon via respiration, but nutrients are coming. You could draw arrows for nutrients coming back here as well. So the main recyclers of nutrients are in this detrital-based system. There's some cool differences that are important to consider between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Like if we're thinking about primary production is happening in both systems, and then at the next level, one of the things, or one of the obvious characteristics, differences between aquatic and terrestrial systems is that aquatic systems get browsed way more. You don't have as much biomass in aquatic ecosystems as you have in terrestrial ecosystems, obviously, right? Think about a forest, all that biomass above ground. In aquatic systems, way more of primary productivity is actually browsed by herbivory. Okay, and it's not that that isn't translating to biomass per se, right? There's just not a lot of biomass, and aquatic organisms are turning over more quickly. But as a proportion of NPP, aquatic ecosystems are actually getting more herbivory. This is also interesting, the scale here, right? So net primary production across either of these ecosystems and how much it varies, right? Orders of magnitude variability, 1,000-fold variation in NPP from the least productive systems to the most productive systems. Likewise, if you go and look at herbivory here as a function of above ground NPP, right? As you increase NPP, herbivore biomass goes up. Not surprising. You need more food for more herbivores. But there are clear differences in managed versus natural systems, with natural systems generally getting less herbivore biomass per unit of NPP than managed systems. How come?
Managed systems try to produce exactly what the animals want, or more in terms of what the actual plants that those cows are going to want.
Okay, so there could be something about quality of food, so maybe it attracts them. What else is fundamental differences between managed versus natural systems that could help us understand this relationship between productivity versus biomass and the controls on that, for example?
Would it maybe have something to do with the natural defenses of grasses and natural systems decreasing NPP, whereas managed, we're trying to get rid of those and maximize?
Although we spray, right? So if you think about insects, right? We use chemicals to remove insects.
So external inputs
Like
nitrogen.
So how would nitrogen, I can see how nitrogen would affect this, but how would it affect that you get more herbivores per unit of productivity? Other than, that's kind of what you were getting at, right?
I mean, they're protected
How?
by fences and people and.
Exactly. So again, this is pointing at something about the controls. Think about, we might have systems that are actually managed for more productivity of a alfalfa, right? Alfalfa can sustain more herbivores than something like, I don't know, cheatgrass. Thank you. Right? It's a more nutritious food source, and so you get more, as an herbivore, there's more bang for your buck. But the other part of that is that the top-down pressures on herbivores are largely gone, right? Like, we keep predators out. We shoot wolves that get into fields, right? We put fences around things, okay? And so hinting at the mechanisms of the controls on some of these dynamics, you can see in some of these differences between how humans have manipulated systems versus just the way things are in natural systems. So I mentioned this huge variation in the quantity of biomass consumed by herbivores. So NPP here, herbivore biomass here, and we go from deserts, right, where a fair proportion of it is actually consumed. But for the most part, as you go out here, NPP in forests is very high, herbivore biomass is relatively low. Okay, so what are some of the differences that might explain why most of this biomass and productivity in these ecosystems is being unconsumed while it's being, a greater proportion of it is actually being consumed in some of these? What are some of those differences that would matter in that case? Again, it gets back to the question, why do most forests lack a whole bunch of herbivores?
Well, most of the NPP's going towards like woody growth that's like unavailable for herbivory.
Okay, so it's a chemical, in some ways you could argue that wood production is a chemical defense, right? It's producing a compound that organisms can't consume, right? So if you devote a higher proportion or you allocate more carbon to structural components and as little as you can to actual photosynthetic components, then even though there may be tons of biomass in forests, actually a very, very small percentage of it is actually edible, right? What else? How do plants protect themselves against herbivores? And how does that vary as you go from a grassland to a forest?
Grow tall.
Okay, so structurally they could just build they could be like the giraffe, right? The giraffe adapted to tall things, right? And there aren't, in many cases at least, herbivores will browse almost anything. If you look at like trees around here and you know the line that goes across as you drive down the street, herbivores will browse it. And so in that case it's just, if they can get to it, they can eat it, and if they can't, then most of it is actually protected, at least from the herbivores we're thinking of are these big kind of animal things. Insects can get to anything. So let's actually think about insects. But you're right, absolutely. So plant morphology can influence what can get to them. Let's think about insects. How do plants defend themselves against insects?
They create secondary metabolites to just keep ward them off.
Yeah,
They're
so
toxic.
Think about all the, when we talked about NPP and the fate of NPP, a large portion of plant NPP is devoted towards building compounds that actually protects them against herbivory. Okay, so and physical defenses, you see that all the time, right? Or you probably, there's obvious examples, cacti, right? Or things with spines, or things with hairy, hair on them. Some of that is about water, but also some of it is about physical protection against herbivores. But chemical defenses, and there's just a huge array of compounds. A lot of our medicines, actually, alkaloids and things, coffee, right? Coffee is a defense, right? And the alkaloids that we like in coffee, part of that is a chemical defense by that plant to actually prevent herbivory by certain organisms. Okay, so I would argue that plant defenses, when we talk about trophic dynamics, it's these defenses that both chemical, largely chemical, and to a much lesser extent physical, that are regulating the energy flow. This is just another representation of that. That's all reflecting the fact that plants are investing significant proportion of NPP into defenses. This is one from a study site, my study site in Costa Rica. The common name is the alligator tree, but there's tons of species like this. You can't, if you bump into them, you get skewered because they have these crazy, big, huge, these are like this big around, so giant spines on them. This is another palm tree. This is the Pejivaye palm that's common throughout neotropics. This is the palm oil where this is what they grow for palm oil. But they're covered in these spines, and that's obviously not a defense against insects per se, but just an example of physical defenses. The most of them, these plants are just waging war against animals through chemicals, right? And bacteria do the same thing in soils. It's just wholesale chemical warfare going on with all of them producing chemicals to essentially hurt your neighbors. So like penicillin, right? The reason we discovered penicillin was because there's an organism that makes this compound to kill bacteria, right? The fungi produces a compound, a chemical compound, to kill its neighbors, right? To increase its success. And plants are doing similar things in order to kill their herbivores, or at least deter their herbivores. Most chemical defenses, and I say most, I'm not even actually aware of any that aren't carbon and nitrogen based. There may be some, but the vast majority of plant compounds that are used in chemical defense are carbon and nitrogen, or a combination of carbon and nitrogen based compounds. So what are some clear, like, carbon based compounds? You said structure, so I would argue lignin is a chemical defense that's carbon based. What other ones? Think of how plants around here respond to, like, herbivory and insect disturbances. So pitch, so that's a carbon, right? Resins and polyphenols and things like that. So that would be another good example of a carbon-based defense mechanism. What are other ones?
What is it that, like common chokecherry has, like ascorbic acid or something that
Okay.
makes it unpalatable to grazers?
Yeah, so things like acids, alkaloids, those sorts of compounds, right? The things that are poisonous, right? Why, if you eat the wrong edible plant, you're going down, because that it's just defenses, right? A prevention against herbivory, and lots of those. Most of those, the ones that we would commonly think about, the alkaloids and those sorts of things, are nitrogenous based, right? They have proteins in them, right? And proteins are the nitrogen-based defenses. Okay, so this explains, both of these things kind of help explain. Did you guys read the Harrison paper, Why is the World Green? The Green World Hypothesis? You have to read it if you haven't yet, because it's sort of a classic hypothesis in ecology that explains, right, or sort of invokes these top-down versus bottom-up controls on herbivores and plants. So these would be an example of a bottom-up control, right? So plant defenses that are products of NPP that are regulate, or that are helping plants to defend themselves against herbivores. Okay? The top-down on control on herbivory would be what's eating these guys, right? And so that's where we get into predator and prey dynamics. We think about a system with vegetation, an herbivore like elk, and a predator like wolves. Right? The bottom-up controls, defenses, preventing the elk from actually eating the grasses. The top-down controls being the wolves are preying on those consumers and keeping their populations in check from the top down.
So do we see more energy put into defenses for plants that don't regenerate as often? So plants that are longer lived, do they put more of their portion of energy into defenses?
That's a good question. I don't know. You would suspect, right, that there's a strategy in long-lived growth strategies. You would suspect that part of that, in order to live a long time, you have to be well defended, as opposed to sort of the R strategy, right, where you're just strength in numbers, and if you have lots of numbers and a fast kind of a lifestyle that's more about quick, and growing quickly, that there's a trade-off between long-lived and the ability to invest in defenses. I don't know the answer to your question. I would suspect there's a it seems like an intuitive trade-off there, that longer-lived species, slower-growing species may have more defenses, but it's also, there's all sorts of things that help explain the strategies of R. You guys know this, R versus K selected species? Is that concept familiar to everyone? Okay, so weedy species being the R selected, and so as a reproduction strategy, for example, they produce tons of seeds, right? Lots of energy into producing massive quantities. In an animal world, having lots of offspring versus, care and nurturing of a single offspring, longer gestation periods, longer rearing periods, things like that. And so there's more to it than just defenses, but I would suspect there's a pretty obvious trade-off. And that if you looked broadly, like a synthesis, assuming there's information on this, that you would find that the longer-lived species generally are more effective at defending themselves. Around here, there's really only, I mean, you could argue that the reason that that we have long-lived species around here, though, maybe isn't as related to defense. I mean, the climate change and the beetle thing has become kind of a game changer here, but typically in systems where you don't have tons of herbivores, it doesn't make sense for plants to invest much in defense. There's a really great study, one of my favorite studies was about, and I'll put this up in case you guys are interested. I don't know if you guys are interested to read these papers, but if you're not, no big deal. But I thought, if I'm giving them to you, it's because I think they're either really cool or really important. But there was a study that came out in Science in like mid-2000s or something that looked at herbivory versus chemical defense, again, and it was in the Amazon. And it looked at a tree growing on two different soil types and what happened when you essentially excluded herbivores from each of those two systems. And it's this really cool, the results showed this really cool trade-off between energy acquisition and energy, or fertility, I should say, and defenses. And if there are lots of predators and you're in a fertile system, then you have to make defenses because the herbivores are trying to get you. But if you exclude those herbivores, then the plants shut down the production of those chemicals, and they don't invest much in defense. So there's this another cool trade-off between plants and their ability over time to invest in defenses. This is another one of my favorite examples. This is the acacia family, and acacia ants. Do you guys know this story? So these guys, this is not a photo from the site where I work, but these guys are everywhere. And if you touch an acacia seedling and you don't realize it, you soon do, because the acacias actually secrete this compound, like this nectar almost, that these ants become addicted to, basically. So it's an alkaloid, and it's like not unlike cocaine for us. This is the cocaine to these ants. And these ants essentially, in return for this nectar, protect these acacia trees against all of the other herbivores that might come and try and eat it. So if you shake an acacia tree, acacia seedling, the ants come out of these holes and go right for you, and they pack a punch if they bite you. But another cool example about an investment that a plant has made in a strategy by providing the ant, which could otherwise be an herbivore, to it, by providing it with something, it recruits them to help protect it.
What about recruiting herbivory? Recruiting herbivory.
Yeah, what about it?
How much energy or NPP is allocated to that for production to induce seed dispersal or whatever you want?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and think about all the variability, right? From tiny wind dispersed seeds to the Brazil nut, right? That's like a bowling ball. I mean, a huge amount of variability in how much plants are investing in that. But people have done studies as a function of NPP, how much is seed production or fruit production, and it can be, a big chunk of it. Usually when you see NPP measurements, at least in terrestrial systems, the NPP measurements include that. So they're talking about fine litter fall, and fine litter fall would include fruits that are dropping into litter traps. So, and branches smaller than 5 millimeters. So, but yes, there's quite a bit of production, or energy invested into that, and partly, in pollination too, right? So building big showy flowers, right? That's part of attracting, not herbivores per se, but pollinators. I don't think trees are making fruit to attract herbivory of their photosynthesis, though, right? And most of the You know, the birds consume fruits in the trees, but that's a strategy for, that they're trying to get them to do that so that they distribute the seeds. Most of, at least where I work, most of the seeds in the trees are actually reproduced by fruit. And it's why actually land use change, especially in the tropics, is such a big deal, because you don't have a lot of wind dispersed seeds. So if you defoliate a place or cut down and tract a forest, the way you get birds back into it, you could get birds into it from the surrounding area, but if there's no place for them to perch and roost, then they don't tend to visit it very often, and actually, so recovery gets slowed down. In Brazil, you've probably maybe seen the Brazil nut trees, where they, even when there's a huge, like soybean field, it might have Brazil nut trees in it, and part of that is about, well, part of it is just it's the national tree of Brazil. But also, they've shown the benefits of that because the animal seed dispersers come and perch in those trees and bring the other seeds and help, you know, in abandoned systems, they help regenerate the species that are lost. Okay, so top-down control. And these are some of the, I guess, widely known and popular examples around here, especially thinking about Yellowstone and the, you know, the importance of the links between elk and wolves, right, and herbivory. So, what are some of you guys heard of some of those issues? What do you got?
Elk are not as, they're not as scared because they don't have as many predators, so they're apt to browse longer on things like aspen and create big patches where there's no aspen, which then creates all sorts of different problems. It just kind of cascades down.
Exactly, and this is, you know, around here, especially in a lot of the studies looking at, you know, and we've reintroduced wolves in some places. There's lots of politics around this part of ecology that it's really interesting, the mixing and when ecology becomes political. But you guys maybe know Mark Hebblewhite and some of his work looking at wolves and the effects of wolves. So these elk obviously do big, let's just say they can make big changes in ecosystems when their populations become big. But hunters like lots of elk, right? And people have argued that in order to keep ecosystems actually healthy, you need these top predators to remove these herbivores. And there's been a big sort of study and lots of politics around wolves in general, but some of Mark's work has shown that people were arguing that the reason that the bitterroot elk populations have gotten lower, and keep in mind lower is relative. When Lewis and Clark got here, there were no elk. There were like almost no elk around here.
There's no elk in Bitterroot.
Yeah, most of the elk around were actually in grasslands and plains. Same with grizzly bears, right? So grizzly bears and elk have traditionally been a plains species. So the elk numbers now are compared to historical numbers are huge. I mean, there's like 300,000 elk in Colorado or something. I mean, it's just amazing how many elk there are. But hunters want as many elk as there can be because they gotta shoot an elk, right? I gotta be successful in hunting. There's the politics around here. People have argued that it's these wolves are actually predating these elk, and so that's why the bitterroot elk numbers are actually low. Right? And so Mark Hebblewhite got a big grant to look at to actually do this, and so he's been following elk calves during the spring and watching and seeing what happens to calves, and finding that actually very few elk are preyed on by wolves. That it's actually mountain lions and bears, of all things, that are killing a lot of the elk around here. But nonetheless, there's, this species is at the heart of it around here, and so many interesting studies showing that when you remove top predators, that this has big effects on ecosystems. So here's the green world hypothesis, right? If we have a green world, essentially, if we only have herbivores in that world, you would predict a barren world, right? So even with plant defenses, you would predict that if herbivores, right, and this is a less green world, a barren world is proposes a little bit too much of a contrast because it doesn't acknowledge the fact defenses, right? And herbivores would never be able to completely consume all of the biomass in a system. But the idea here makes sense, I think, is that in the absence of carnivores, herbivores would tend to make the world more brown, right? When you have this, in this case, 3 trophic levels, right? So we have bottom-up controls that are regulating herbivores, but also top-down controls that are regulating herbivores. This is where you would expect, again, a green world, that both of those top-down and bottom-up controls are limiting the number of herbivores and enhancing the greenness, right? The NPP. In this case, right, humans have actually reduced top predators in the system, and this is largely why we're managing ecosystems right now, right? Is that we're seeing the effects of a lack of predators in ecosystems in the form of decreases in productivity in more barren ecosystems, right? So the elk prey or elk consuming aspect. But all of these are, I think, you could identify ecosystems currently where all of these are occurring, right? And ultimately, these ones, these predators that are providing these top-down controls and the links between humans and those top predators are kind of at the heart of a lot of these ecological studies, like this one that I want to show from. I'll just show you this really quickly, and I hope this illustrates in a way that I can't by just yapping. You guys can actually see this. I did actually put the Pasteur, so John Pasteur wrote a paper in Bioscience in 1988, and I put it up on the Dropbox in the reading, and I have a reference to it at the end. But if you're interested in this sort of set of ecological feedbacks,
That's what I was wondering. Probably a helicopter. I'd like to think of some dude in a tree, but probably not.
Isle Royal is a secluded 893 square mile island in the middle of Lake Superior. This park is one of the least visited national parks in the United States, but the most revisited because of its beauty and seclusion. It has no human inhabitants, but is home to many moose and wolves who significantly affect their surroundings. Isle Royal is the site of the longest lasting predator versus prey study in the world. As late as 2009, there were 25 wolves on the island, but after the spring 2017 count, just 2 wolves remain. Because the remote island is isolated, the only way for new wolves to get to the park is over an ice bridge that can form over Lake Superior during cold winters. Climate change is making those bridges rare, says John Vucetich, a professor at Michigan Technological University.
Our understanding of ice bridges starts with going back to the 1960s. Ice bridges would have formed in about 8 out of every 10 years. More recently, they form in approximately 1 out of every 10 years. So from about an 80% chance of occurring in a year to about a 10% chance of occurring in a year. Some projections would have the next ice bridge, whenever that occurs, could possibly be the last.
Because the wolf population is so low, moose numbers are increasing by about 22% each year. Vucetich studies predation ecology in Isle Royal. He is a leader in the Isle Royal Wolf Moose Project, which is in its 60th year.
That makes it the longest study of any predator-prey system in the world. And the centerpiece of that work has always been to count the abundance of both wolves and moose. This winter, what we found out basically 2 main features, that the population was still just 2 wolves. We also understand that it's the same 2 wolves that had been there as the previous year. Those 2 wolves happen to be both brother and sister and father and daughter. They do seem to still be quite capable of killing moose. which means they can feed themselves. The other thing we learned about the wolf moose population this past winter is how many moose there are. There are approximately 1,600 moose on the island right now.
When a predator population crashes, the ripple effects of that crash are known as a trophic cascade. In 1994, Isle Royale became the first known terrestrial trophic cascade.
And so at the top trophic level are wolves, and what sometimes happens is that wolves affect the next trophic level, which would be the moose, by reducing their abundance. In reducing the abundance of moose, it causes the next trophic level below that, which is the vegetation, to do much better.
Mark Romansky, the Division Chief of National Resources at Isle Royale, has worked on the island for almost 20 years.
So you can imagine without any wolves, moose are essentially allowed to do whatever they want, and that could mean browsing to unprecedented levels. Some of the larger sort of forest system-wide impacts is, with moose having impacts on browsing certain species, such as balsam fir. And some of the impacts include like changing the shape of these trees. Essentially, you have 1 meter tall trees that are 30, 40, 50 years old because they've been chronically browsed. And so we're not getting regeneration of new balsam fir trees. And then that impacts also the type of forest community that you have over the long term.
The other really important creature that's affected would be beaver. Beavers will tend to be much more abundant when the wolves are not doing well, which is what's occurring right now. The beaver population is almost doubled in the last 4 or 5 years. And in doing so, they will make more beaver dams. And beavers in particular are what are sometimes referred to as architects of ecosystems. They really can change the overall structure of an ecosystem. They do this by making dams, and when they make a dam, they flood a river basin or drainage, and then they start to cut the trees down that are in that area.
To bring back balance, the Park Service is looking at the reintroduction of wolves to the island. The possible reintroduction is leading to more questions about the National Park Service mission to protect the parks from human influence.
And if we're going to answer this question, whether we should bring wolves back to Isle Royale, we couldn't possibly answer it without first asking, what is the purpose of a protected area? What is the purpose of our national parks? And that's a pretty big and broad question, but in this particular case, what it hones in on is, what do we want to do with respect to climate change and our national parks? If climate change takes some things from national parks, are we okay with that? Will we just let climate change do that? Or if climate change takes things from our national parks and there's a chance to mitigate that or undo it, should we try to do that as well? It's a very big question. It's a question that goes much wider than just Isle Royale. And Isle Royale is going to be kind of an important, I guess for lack of a better word, test case for understanding whether we as an American people think it's good to try to mitigate some of these effects of climate change or not so much.
So the fate of the wolves of Isle Royale is in our hands. These are our national parks. This is Kim Leholm signing off for the PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs from Isle Royale.
There you go, guys. Some big questions for you to think about. Okay, we can stop there. We'll finish up just a little bit about this, and then we'll go quickly into talking about temporal dynamics. So succession, the next big concept that I want to